Welcome to this chess video, everyone. Yes, indeed, I do have blue hair. I had a USCF Blitz tournament just recently, and I thought it would be just something kind of fun to just tint my hair blue, kind of have that little Sonic speed going for that Blitz tournament, and see how that went. I did pretty well. I came in 4th. I'm pretty happy with those results. But we can use this blue hair and kind of use this to our advantage, because now, for this video, we are about to discuss the Hedgehog formation in chess. Kind of a good little segue with the Sonic theme. And so let's just get right into this, because there's a lot to share with this really cool opening. So first, I'm sure most people know what regular chess openings are, where both sides have opening theory, and you just go your move, my move, your move, my move, and we just go back and forth with white and black. But system openings are a little bit different, right? I'm sure most people have heard of the London system, where you put your pieces in almost always the very same place, regardless of what your opponent plays. But systems and regular openings are not the only things in chess that are like that. There's also something in chess called formations, and they're very similar to systems, but this has to do with the pawn structure. And so in many different openings, you can actually play the same patterns in this formation, and you're going to get the same type of plans, even though it's a completely different opening. And so the Hedgehog is one of these formations. Now, this formation is most common probably in the symmetrical English opening, but it can come up in many different openings. So here's what it would look like in the English opening. So this could be for white or black. I prefer to play the Hedgehog from the black side, because as white, I would prefer to use the extra tempo to perhaps play something a little bit less passive, but you can actually play the Hedgehog with either color. So for this one, black is going to play this Hedgehog formation. And so if they played the English opening, we'll play the symmetrical English with c5. Normal opening moves might go like this. Both sides continue to develop. Both sides fee and shadow a bishop to the long diagonal. Developing some pieces here. Very normal, natural developing moves. Trading off the c pawn for a white's d pawn is very important. They take back. We play our pawn up one square. They move, take the center. And now here, after a6, we have this Hedgehog formation. And so this is what it would look like in the English. But really what's the focus of this formation has to do with the pawns. And so if I were to remove all the other pieces and we only look at the pawns, it would look something like this. And so now let's talk about some of the main ideas that black is playing for when they play this type of setup, regardless of what opening this comes out of. So the very first key point is that black has exchanged off their c pawn for white's d pawn. And so that is, of course, a slight advantage in the sense that this d pawn is a center pawn, and black has gotten rid of a pawn that's almost a center pawn, but it's not one of their d or e pawns, and so they're actually a little more flexible, right? Like from white's perspective, they only have one center pawn now, whereas black has two. And black has also not committed one of their central pawns to the d5 and e5 square. Very often, when white plays a move like e4, it is very common for black to play a move like e5. And although that's a very good approach, they have committed their center pawn to the e5 square. And very similarly, if white were to start the game with d4, well then black in a lot of openings will play d5. But in doing so, you've committed your pawn to that central square, d5. So what's nice about this setup is we haven't committed either of these pawns to one of these central squares. And so we're very flexible in which one we are going to advance. And our opponent is kept guessing a little bit. Now we also have some very key ideas here, because we also have pawn breaks in our favor. Now specifically, if we look at pawn breaks, you could look at my video on pawn levers. Something like f5 is one idea, striking at the pawn lever on this pawn. There's also d5, and there's also b5. So all three of these are pawn levers that are options. Now f5 is the least appealing from a pawn structure perspective because we are weakening our king. And generally speaking, we want to keep these pawns very close to our king and unmoved. So our main pawn breaks in this opening is either d5 or b5. And so both of those could come with some real potential. If either of those pawn breaks comes out, then black's slightly passive position is going to explode and really start contesting the center. And this is something very valuable, because of course this is only the pawn formation, but we are going to have our pieces nicely protected behind these spines that we have here that kind of characterize this Hedgehog opening, where our pawns are just slightly advanced and our pieces are just behind those pawns, adding a lot of support to help with these pawn breaks. Now I really like this as kind of a creative opening that's a little bit more advanced, but it really works well at the intermediate level, because if you know what you're doing and your opponent doesn't, then you just play these very thematic ideas, very similar to a system opening like the London system, and then you have the same concepts that you're going for game after game, and your opponent might not necessarily know what plans you're going for, but you already do because you've positioned your pieces so optimally to play for the setup. Now, with that being said, where should the pieces be optimally placed? Well, in a lot of situations, not a guarantee, this is what an optimal setup for black could look like. So here with more pieces on the board, we can see that in many lines to try and support these pawn breaks here, usually the pieces are going to be located as follows. We'll have the 2 knights here. Of course, this knight is helping prepare the d5 pawn break. The other knight here is also kind of valuable because we're keeping the ideas open of potentially e5, and we are also putting a little extra support on this c5 square, which we no longer have a pawn on that file. This bishop is just really nice, of course guarding this pawn before it advances to d5. And in some lines it might even come out to f6, even more active. This bishop I think is very obvious, it's just contesting the long diagonal, very nicely located. And then the rooks, of course, are going to be supporting potential pawn breaks going up the board, especially the c rook, which because there is no pawn here on the c file, this is a half-open file in black's favor. And so they might put a lot of pressure on what is usually a pawn on c4. Queen is just going to be on c7 to help support itself with the rook on that half-open file. Now, it is a hedgehog formation regardless of where their pieces are. So the only thing that makes it this formation is when we have the pawns in this configuration. Now, the reason that I had white's pawns up here on c4 and e4 is because when black chooses this passive setup, most of the time white is going to put their pawns on e4 and c4. And this is the Maroczy bind formation. Most people who play the Sicilian defense are probably very familiar with this structure, but it can actually come up from many different openings, as with this entire hedgehog formation. But let's say that you're not an English opening player and you don't play the symmetrical English for black's perspective. Well, you can actually play this opening in a Queen's Indian defense. So you could easily see how this could come up, where white would start with d4, knight f6, c4, very common, e6, and if they play knight f3, then the Queen's Indian defense is characterized by a b6. And you can see how this could very easily turn into a hedgehog opening, because this hedgehog formation will be complete as soon as you play the pawn to a6 and d6. And then you play your very natural ideas. Probably this knight is going to go to d7, but it doesn't have to. Maybe it'll go to c6. Of course, we're flexible. This bishop will probably go to e7. This bishop will probably go to the long diagonal on b7. And the queen in most lines will probably go to c7. And already we've played very many moves, and this is more or less opening theory, even though you're just setting up the thematic ideas. So your opponent might actually be struggling to find the opening theory, and you play the very simple plans constantly game after game, and you know what to do, your opponent doesn't. And then you have a very good position once you play those pawn breaks and really start fighting for the center. Now, of course, I did mention the Sicilian defense. So how could this come up from the Sicilian? Well, actually, from either Khan or Taimanov variations, we can get this hedgehog formation. So one example might look something like this, where we play the Sicilian with c5 we start with. We develop this way, exchange off our c-pawn as characteristic of our pawn structure. In this line, we'll put the knight on c6, not the traditional knight b to d7 that we have in a lot of these hedgehog formations, but again, it is about the pawn structure, not necessarily exactly the pieces being on those squares. All of this is opening theory. We put our pawn on d6, we continue developing, we play a6, kicking their knight back, we continue developing, and now we play our pawn to b6. And you can see that already we have these pawns here, and this is what characterizes this hedgehog formation. And if they continue to develop, move like bishop to e3, we can actually put our bishop on the long diagonal. And as you see, this is all still opening theory, but we're already just playing the normal ideas of our little formation here. So it's very easy to learn and implement because very similar to other systems like the London system, you just play the same concepts over and over. Now, what about playing this from white's perspective? Because I did say you could actually play this with colors reversed. Well, here's one good example. So here's Bobby Fischer actually using this hedgehog formation against Ulf Anderssen. Not to be confused with Adolf Anderssen, the Romantic era chess player, but Ulf Anderssen, which was more a contemporary of Fischer. So Bobby Fischer starts with pawn to b3. We get e5, plays his bishop to the long diagonal. Black plays normal developing moves, and now white is going to go for this hedgehog formation with colors reversed. So we'll have normal developing moves. I'll just kind of breeze through these briefly. And now you might start recognizing our system here, where white still has their c-pawn. They haven't traded it off for black's d-pawn yet, because this hasn't advanced this far here. But we are very close to doing that. And if they ever play d5, we'll trade off the c-pawn. And notice that this is the exact same formation. It's just mirrored, because they are white, and this is the exact same hedgehog formation that we were looking at. Now they would continue playing. We develop. They play d5. We exchange. And now you might recognize this. And this is the exact same setup we were talking about. And in this hedgehog formation, Bobby Fischer won a really spectacular game. Now, I'm not going to go over this game in this video. If you're really interested, mention the YouTube comments and perhaps I'll make a video on this game. But in the meantime, this is a really historic thing because when Bobby Fischer played this game, this really left an impression on Ulf Anderssen, the opponent playing black. And what actually happened was, because Ulf Anderssen lost such a wonderful game to Bobby Fischer here, he actually started exploring this hedgehog formation himself. And later on, one of the biggest advocates for the hedgehog formation was actually Ulf Anderssen himself, who played this from his own games. Now let's go back here, because you might recall that I showed the Sicilian defense example, and indeed this is actually one of Ulf Anderssen's. So in this game, he actually played against Anatoly Karpov, and he actually outplayed Karpov and won this game. And so this game will kind of show us more or less our model game and show how you could play the hedgehog formation if you want to take up this opening for either white or black. Now I'll just go back real briefly, just the very beginning, just because most people probably forgot how we got here. We started with e4, c5, we started Sicilian move order. Again, many different openings could end up with the hedgehog formation. It's very flexible. Both sides continue playing this way. And again, I did show this earlier in the video, so I'm kind of breezing through. That way the ideas aren't repeated too much. We do see white has this Maroczy bind setup with their two pawns on e4 and c4, as usually will happen. But that is not required for it to be a hedgehog. It'll still be a hedgehog formation, regardless of where white's pieces and pawns are, as long as black has their pawns here, on the squares highlighted in red, and they've exchanged off their c-pawn for white's d-pawn. And then we continue with the game, and this is the position that we were just at. So in this game, Anatoly Karpov continued with rook to c1, normal developing move, and now we've played this hedgehog formation before, and so we know that we should put our rooks here. These are the optimal squares, probably queen to c7, and we will continue to play very logically from here. With that in mind, he plays rook to e8, Karpov plays queen b3, and now he actually brings this knight back to d7. Now, oftentimes you might recall that this b knight is usually here on d7, and so now because this knight is already committed, this knight is kind of filling the role of where the b knight probably would have gone in other lines. Now again, this is still the same formation because the pieces are flexible. See, with a system like the London system, you have to pretty much play them to the exact same spot, game after game after game, very rigidly. But a formation is a little bit more flexible. And so as long as you have the same pawn setup, then you can just kind of play your pieces based on whether they might be best in that very given game. Karpov plays a rook to the half-open file. We get our other rook to c8. Rook d2, and of course, if you're a hedgehog formation player, you probably know the next move, queen c7. And we've basically completed a really optimal setup here. We've completed our development because the rooks have seen each other, and all of our pieces, other than the king, are developed off the back rank. And so now it's all about playing for either d5 or b5 in this formation. Move their queen back, trying to add even more control over their half-open d file. They relocate their queen back a little. f3, and then bishop a8. And now it might look a little bit strange that it looked like we were fully developed, and now we're retreating our queen and bishop back to the back rank. But notice that because this a rook is now over here on c8, it's actually not really interfering with the rooks seeing each other. And so sometimes black, being a little bit cramped, can afford to kind of move their pieces back and shuffle around a bit. And as long as white can't really open up the position quite yet, then black isn't really punished in the fact that they have a cramped position. They can slowly untangle themselves, and although they have a slight space disadvantage, black's position is very solid from a pawn structure perspective, and there's really no apparent weaknesses, which is one really good advantage of this formation. Basically, you just kind of sit there, kind of curl up your spines, kind of like a hedgehog, and you just sit there and wait for your opponent to make a mistake. Now, this is a really clever opening if you think your opponent is going to play really aggressively against you, and perhaps overplay against you, and then maybe make some speculative move that may or may not be best, and then turns out to be some mistake that you can take advantage of. So you just sit here and you play very solidly. But you can also play for your pawn breaks, so you're not just sitting there without a plan. Karpov played queen to f1. We improved the knight, knight c to e5. And now they retreat the knight back, probably intending to put this knight long term on d2 and then go to a better square than it was. Of course, it wasn't doing much on a3, and it wasn't going here because of our spine on a6 controlling the b5 square. Knight back to f6. King over to h1 is just a very small little prophylactic move, very characteristic of Anatoly Karpov, and the reason he does this is probably because here his king was slightly exposed because he's pushed the pawn to f3, and so from a pawn structure perspective, this entire diagonal is slightly weaker. Now, he does have a dark square bishop here, so it is not the worst thing in the world, but just tucking your king away in the corner is a little bit safer to prevent itself from getting into checks. Now, in the Bobby Fischer game, although we did not look at that, he actually ended up playing pawn to g4. And whether that happens in this game or not, at least Karpov is keeping the options on the table by putting his king slightly safer in the corner. So it's a very flexible move, doesn't really commit much. And now black plays pawn to h6, which is kind of a slow improving waiting move. The computer, as you can see, actually prefers a little bit more aggressive to play pawn to h5. But it is a little more natural to keep your pawns closer to your king, that way you don't create as many square weaknesses in front of your king. Plays a rook back. And now we have this slow little relocating. As very common in the hedgehog formation, because you're at a slight space disadvantage, you might have to be relocating your pieces. But if you want to really learn positional chess, and you want some practice that really teaches piece development, this is actually a really good formation to learn, because you play this in really every single game, you know, whether you have white or black if you want to play it. And it's a formation you can employ with a lot of different openings. So you have the same ideas with piece development, and you kind of get a feel for how pieces should be developed in response to where the opponent puts their pieces. Karpov continues developing. Now we relocate the rook, trying to support our d5 move. A little bit of relocating, of course, and now finally we play the pawn to d5. As we mentioned with this formation, the pawn is usually going to d5 or b5, and in this game we got d5 first. They choose to take with their c-pawn. There's some trades on d5. And now black chooses to develop their bishop and blockade this potentially strong pawn that's on d5. So now, even though d5 is a pass pawn, it is also an isolated pawn, and it is blockaded. So now it really comes down to, can white make use of this pawn? And if not, then black might actually stand to be better long term. Karpov brings his knight back. And now you really have to hand it to Ulf Anderssen here, because he actually plays a really interesting sacrifice. Now, this is not necessary, and actually the computer does not approve of this. The engine just says that black is probably best to just either keep developing, something like get their bishop off the back rank, that way then it's helping defend this a6 pawn, or you could just play b5, advance to gain a little bit more space, and that addresses the threat that they have on this pawn as well. But instead of this, he addresses the threat in a different way. He just takes the bishop with his rook. Of course, you're playing this exchange sacrifice intentionally, but now here comes this capture on h2. And so he's down the exchange, but he's also opened up the king by taking the pawn on h2. So really, black is only down 1 point of material out of that sequence that we just had. Now they are down by 2 for the time being. Karpov moves his knight to kick the bishop. Bishop, of course, comes back, saves itself. They play the rook over. And now we play the thematic pawn to b5. Now again, in this opening, we've played, usually playing for d5. We've completed that. And then they're usually playing for b5. And now we've completed that. And so slowly but surely, our pawn spines are moving slowly up the board. And this is actually very hard for white to take advantage of. Now white continues to improve their pieces. Black does the same. And now he's trying to add some very valuable support to this isolated pawn. Black puts their knight on a really active square. And white tries to go after this advanced pawn, trying to prove that b5 is actually slightly overextended, and maybe they can exchange on b5 and open up the a file for their other rook. in this case, black is realizing that this pass pawn, although it looks scary, isn't really that big of a threat. And so they actually relocate their rook to e8, where it might be more active on the completely open file. And it's completely open because there are no white pawns or black pawns on this file. So black, long term, might have really good control over the e file. There are trades on b5. And now white must try and contest the open e file. The engine prefers just pushing d6 and trying to make your pass pawn even more of a threat, but Karpov's response is very natural as well. Bringing the bishop back is an okay move. Rook to e5 instead might have been a little bit better, because then you're putting more pressure on this pawn and threatening potential ideas of coming to h5. Now, Ulf Anderssen was missing a lot of these rook h5 ideas in the game, or maybe he saw them and just chose not to go for them. Queen c5, adding even more support to this isolated pawn on d5. And now they go back to try and blockade the pawn. Now, this is still an okay move. Now, the computer actually prefers that black exchanges first on e4 here, and then comes back and blockades this way. That way, this pawn is blockaded by the knight, and this pawn is blockaded by the bishop. But back to the real game, now white has a chance to save their bishop by retreating it back, but instead of that, white didn't really see the danger in giving up their bishop, and so they try and improve their knight instead. They move it back to a2, most likely with the idea of coming to b4 in some lines, or maybe they can even come to c1 and then relocate to like d3. But now black has the chance to trade and take that bishop. They take back, and now we can actually gain time attacking the queen. The queen moves back, and now rook e5, which is the idea we mentioned earlier, but now Ulf Anderssen is after it, and the potential threats on h5 are actually very strong. They advance their pawn, perhaps to create a little bit more space for the king. Maybe if there's a check on h5, the king might want to come up to g2. The queen goes to e8, of course putting even more pressure on that file. And white does the same. Bishop to b7, slow improvement move. King g1. And now they're actually relocating their knight, trying to get all of their pieces to even more active squares. In this case, it might even go to g5, and you're still putting pressure on this pawn, just like you were on f6, but you're slightly more advanced. And that's the kind of thing that you can do in the hedgehog formation, where you just slowly make progress against your opponent. And you have a very solid pawn structure in the process. Karpov brings his knight back. Knight g5 was played by Anderssen. Knight d2, and now bishop to b4. And all of these have been pretty natural moves here, and that's why I haven't really spent too long on any one particular move. But now white actually plays a move that's a mistake, which is actually king to f2. And so the reason this is a mistake is actually because black can now trade on d2 and get a favorable position. And I don't need to show a variation because this is actually what happened in the game. And we'll see how black actually made their advantage grow even more. So black did trade on d2. There's this recapture. And now their pieces are simply overloaded, and rook captures e4 would keep a really strong advantage, as their rook on e2 is just left the e-file. But instead of that in the game, Ulf Anderssen went for a slightly inferior knight captures. Although it is still winning, rook captures was a little bit stronger, keeping the rooks on the open file, and not necessarily going after the immediate material. Plays this exchange sacrifice back. They recapture, and Ulf Anderssen is now up 1 point of material. Knight e2, and now bishop c8. Realizing this pawn is actually not that dangerous, and they can afford to relocate their bishop to a better diagonal. See, this bishop really wasn't looking at too much. It was attacking the pawn, but it was fairly inactive in doing so. Now going to the c8 square, they have control over this entire diagonal, and a lot of really good squares their bishop might prefer to go to. Knight c3 was played in the game. Rook e1 was a nice attacking try, but maybe rook to e5 was a little bit better, and they might not get into the trouble that they got into in this game. Where we'll see that when the rook is on e1, although it's not terrible, it has to kind of shuffle around a bit and try and avoid things. We'll see that very shortly. But in the meantime, they played knight back to e2, trying to exploit the fact that their rook is actually misplaced this deep in enemy territory. So it was an attempt at exploiting here. Even stronger, according to the computer, was to just play rook e2 and force the trade of rooks. If things were to trade this way, it would go something like this. Trade here. trade queens as well. And now we've simplified a ton, and although black might be a smidge better, at least now white has a few drawing chances compared to what they have in the game, where things are a little bit trickier with pieces still on the board. So knight e2 is played, trying to exploit that e1 rook. They move the rook away. And then both sides again play this little maneuvering game. Queen c6 is an active move, but I think really there was a better way to deal with a threat. Now if you didn't see it, the threat on the last move here was probably queen to f6 because it is a check, and then you're attacking the rook. Now in this case it is defended by the knight, but that knight might not always be there, and maybe there might be some ideas where you can decoy the defender. Something like, say, bishop to g4, and then you take the knight. So what I speculate is that queen c6 is an improvement move where you control the f6 square so there's no check, and you're helping escort this d-pawn down the board. I think a little bit better than that was probably just to play queen to e4. That way you add more defense to the rook, and you still defend the pawn, but your queen is more centralized. In the game we play bishop to d7, queen d6, queen to the e-file, queen back, and now this relocating. And we're going to see a little bit of shuffling back and forth here of black trying to slowly finagle their way towards white's king. So it kind of breeze through these moves here. You can see that white is trying to hang on with their exposed king, and black is, of course, having a lot of threats. Like, for example, they had to move their king or queen on the last move, because here there was this threat of rook to f1, which would have skewered the king and queen. So they play their queen out of the way, and now they play this move to attack the queen again. Queen comes back, and now infiltrating with the queen. And we can see that it's actually very difficult for white to try and survive this here, as their king is just a little bit too vulnerable. Play some moves here. Black does not want to trade queens. They want to keep attacking white's exposed king. And they keep refusing the queen trade. They bring their rook back into their territory. And now they bring it back there again. And you see there's a lot of shuffling going on here. They push their d-pawn. Rook back. And we see both sides trying to make slow progress. And now rook e7 is a mistake that actually was not exploited in the game. The way to take advantage of this move would have been rook to a8, and now you just have so many checks that you have to worry about here for white, and the game's probably going to be over pretty soon. For example, let's just say that they missed the threats, play a move like queen c3, well then queen f1 check could happen. King moves. Queen f3. King d4, and then queen to d5. And this king is under a lot of pressure. When they go back to e3, we can even threaten bringing the rook over, and then again you're threatening to skewer the queen. But even if you don't have all this calculated out, it's just the fact that white's king is so open in the center of the board, and black's king is much more safe. Now back to the real game, they did not play rook to a1. Instead of that, they tried to go queen to h1 and attack from that side, which is still winning, but just not winning as quickly. Queen f4, and now very similar to the variation, there's queen to g2. And this is going to be very similar where they keep pushing the king up and where you slowly push them further and further to the center of the board and closer to the rest of your pieces. Slowly pushing their king out. And now this looks very similar to the variation with the queen and bishop just doing a really good job of attacking their king. And now finally in this position, Anatoly Karpov actually resigned as white, and Ulf Anderssen won the game with our hedgehog formation. Now the reason why this is resignable at this point is because after king to d2, will probably come rook to a2, and then things are going to probably get traded on c2, and then you're actually dropping the knight, and Karpov, I'm sure, probably saw this far and realized that he was going to lose a minor piece, and black is just completely winning here because this pawn really has no chance of becoming a queen, and you're going to win this game by trading off the queens and then going to a pawn endgame where black has the extra bishop. So I hope this video has taught you a little bit about the hedgehog formation, and maybe now you have a little more curiosity and maybe a little more interest to start playing this kind of thing in your own games. There's many different formations in chess. The hedgehog is just one of the pawn formations. There's many others. And so if that kind of thing interests you as well, then of course subscribe to my channel and maybe we'll make some more videos on other pawn formations or other openings. I've actually had a lot of fun with the Hedgehog formation myself. It was actually a chess.com tournament from one of the clubs that I was in a few years ago. And in that tournament, I actually played the Hedgehog from both white and black, and I actually ended up winning that Blitz tournament. So it's a very fun opening to try once you get the hang of it. I'm pretty sure I was playing the Green Hill music in the background, but even if you don't get hyped with that Sonic theme, at the very least you can enjoy an opening that beat Anatoly Karpov. So it's a very solid opening. If you want to give it a try with something new, make sure to check out the Hedgehog formation. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.